European powers imposed borders and governed through local elites, minorities, royal families, and militaries to protect imperial interests. These arrangements built little inclusivity or local identity. Order and influence came first. Unfortunately, the approach was not unique to the Middle East and has created the same paradigm in Africa and Asia, often with negative consequences that still haunt many countries today. Colonial decisions prioritized external control, elite deals, and unsettled tensions over building a strong, inclusive foundation. Nationalism, Arab, Syrian, Iraqi, Zionist, Palestinian, and others, grew mainly against the imposed order, not from stability. This could explain why later clashes often became coups, civil wars, and struggles for legitimacy. The state existed without a strong social contract with its people. An example is the Alawite minority ruling in Syria or the Ba'ath Sunni party ruling the majority Shia Iraq. Let's analyze the Palestine Question as the most consequential case study of the legacy of colonialism in the region. The colonial legacy played a decisive role in the Palestinian question and the factors explaining why it is still an unresolved issue in the Middle East. The conflict cannot be understood without considering the decisions and actions made by Britain, the colonial power administering Palestine from 1920 to 1948, followed by the agency of Israeli governments, Palestinian leaders, and armed groups in the decades that followed. This period of British rule framed the conflict paradigm from the onset. Over the next 100 years, local and regional actors have deepened the conflict, keeping the issue at the heart of regional unrest. The conflict over Palestine partly stems from modern Zionism, a Jewish nationalist movement that arose in 19th-century Europe in response to anti-Semitism, based on the belief that Jews needed a state for safety and self-determination. Palestine became central not only as a refuge but as the historic Jewish homeland, rooted in Jewish history and memory. A majority of Israelis and Jews around the world view the conflict in secular terms, security, geopolitics, but also is rooted in historic and religious beliefs, fused with nationalism. Britain entered the Palestine dispute in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, supporting a Jewish national home in Palestine. In 1922, this was incorporated into the British Mandate, lasting until 1948. Britain's support reflected wartime strategy, imperial interests, and sympathy among the British political elite for the Zionist doctrine. Crucially, Britain failed to provide an equal political framework for the Arab Palestinian population already living there. Britain backed one national project seeking self-determination at the expense of another population. As Jewish immigration to Palestine increased, especially after World War II and the Holocaust, tensions between Jews and Arabs grew. Britain, the architect of the framework, withdrew without obtaining a settlement, leaving both communities in a doomed predicament. In 1947, the United Nations proposed partitioning Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. Jewish leaders accepted, Arab leaders rejected, arguing it violated Arab majority rights. In 1948, Israel declared independence, and the war immediately followed. Upon Israel winning the war and seizing about 80% of Palestine, about 750,000 Palestinians were displaced. Palestinians call the event the Nakba, Arabic word for catastrophe. The year 1948 marks Israel's creation and Jewish statehood after persecution and the Holocaust, and Palestinian dispossession and loss of political control. From that point on, the Palestinian question no longer remained a local issue. It became one of the region's main contentious and fundamental crises. It has shaped Arab politics, interstate wars, public opinion, and the legitimacy of governments across the Middle East for the last 78 years. The Arab-Israeli wars of 1948, 1956, 1967, and 1973, opposing Israel to all its neighbors, changed the regional balance by strengthening Israel's position in the region and intensified the volatility among most geopolitical actors in the region and the Arab and Muslim worlds, from Morocco to Indonesia. The War of 1967 was especially important because it placed the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem under Israeli control. It gave the balance of power a new structure, one based not only on displacement and contested statehood, but also on military occupation. In the aftermath of these earlier wars, the role of local political actors becomes more important. Israeli governments were not identical in their policies, but many helped entrench the conflict over time through occupation, settlement expansion, military control, and the steady weakening of the conditions for a viable separate Palestinian state, commonly defined as the two-state solution. In the decades after 1967, and especially as Israeli politics moved to the right and extreme right, Israeli society has increasingly framed the West Bank and East Jerusalem not simply as disputed territory, but as part of the historic and biblical land of Israel, a position and sentiment that has crystallized over time and is now shared by most Israelis, including secular ones. A tangible connection to the Bible is the fact that Israelis refer to the West Bank by its Judea and Samaria biblical name. In most Israeli educational textbooks, the delineation between Israel and Palestinian borders, the green line, is often omitted. That shift matters because it helps explain why settlements have now become so central to Israel's expansion policy into Palestinian territory. In 2025, the Israeli government granted permits for 54 new settlements in the West Bank, more than in the previous 20 years combined. For Palestinians, settlement expansion, home evictions, land seizures, and military control represent the continuing loss of land and the decline of any realistic path to self-determination, a predicament that started in 1948 and has barely subsided. For many Israeli settlers and their supporters, the same process is seen as a legitimate return to land they viewed as historically and biblically theirs. This made compromise harder, because the issue was no longer only about borders. It was likewise about identity, history, and moral claim, and what many have defined as a zero-sum game, powered by rhetoric and extreme positions on both sides, rendering the conflict intractable. Benjamin Netanyahu is an important figure in the conflict over the last 30 years, to the present. He assumed power briefly first in 1996, right in the aftermath of the Oslo Accords, which he opposed, and then came back in 2009 and has since dominated the political scene of Israel, helping move Israel's political profile sharply to the right and against any opportunity for a two-state solution for Palestinians. He has prioritized managing rather than resolving the conflict, and the political strategy centered on security, deterrence, and alliance building with right-wing and religious nationalist political actors, culminating in establishing the most right-wing coalition government in Israel's history after the last election in 2022. It is difficult to ignore the role played by Netanyahu in perpetuating the conflict and his desire to strengthen Israel's domination in the region, but also to subjugate Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza to Israeli control. Palestinian political actors have also contributed to the conflict's persistence, though some analysts and experts contend that they did so from a far weaker position. The Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, under Yasser Arafat gradually shifted from armed struggle toward diplomacy and negotiation, especially in the Oslo period in the 1990s. The Accords did not produce a lasting solution for the Palestinians nor establish a path to self-determination and the two-state solution, which was viewed as the most viable framework for allowing Palestinians to self-determine. Since Oslo, Palestinian governance has remained weak, fragmented, West Bank and Gaza under two different Palestinian political parties, and often lacking both institutional strength and public and grassroots legitimacy. Elections have not taken place in the Palestinian territory since 2005. Corruption, internal rivalry, and strategic-related inconsistency weakened the Palestinian political project at key moments. Hamas became another major factor in the region's volatility from the late 1980s onward. It emerged during the First Intifada from the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood and combined Islamist politics with armed resistance. Hamas turned into both a militant actor and a governing authority in Gaza in 2007. Its rejection of Israel's right to exist, attacks on Israeli civilians, rejection of key diplomatic frameworks, and reliance on armed confrontation strengthened Israeli security policies, deepened Palestinian internal division, and weakened the possibility of a unified Palestinian strategy. The split between Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza further damaged Palestinian political cohesion and made the conflict even harder to resolve. However, it is impossible to ignore that Hamas's stronghold over Gaza has also been part of Netanyahu's strategy to keep Palestinian politics divided. The strongest evidence is the fact that Hamas funding by Qatar was channeled through Israeli banks, with tacit knowledge, if not endorsement, from the Israeli government. October 7, 2023, has been a tragic turning point in the conflict for the fate of the Middle East. As stated earlier, the current predicament of the conflict must be considered in light of the deep historical roots that have created a continuum of crises and foregone opportunities for peace. The events of October 7 should be viewed with the same perspective, not as a starting point for a different phase of the conflict, but as a tragic evolution of conditions that were created months, years, and decades earlier. However, the aftermath of that day has taken the conflict to a new paradigm with devastating consequences for Palestinian civilians and any prospect for sustained peace. Hamas's attack on Israel killed civilians and soldiers and triggered one of the most destructive wars in the history of Gaza. Israel framed its military campaign as a war to destroy Hamas and prevent another attack. But the scale of destruction in Gaza, the high civilian death toll, mass displacement, and the collapse of basic infrastructure have also created conditions that are likely to deepen Palestinian anger for years to come. This is one of the central problems with Israel's strategy. Even if Hamas is weakened militarily, the wider political conditions that produced Palestinian militancy are not being resolved. In Gaza, large parts of the population have experienced loss, displacement, hunger, and the destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, and neighborhoods. The West Bank has also become more unstable since October 7. Israeli military operations intensified, settler violence increased, movement restrictions expanded, and displacement pressures grew in several areas. OCHA reported in April 2026 that more than 33,000 Palestinians remained displaced from 3 northern West Bank refugee camps because of Israeli military operations, and that another 5,700 Palestinians had been displaced because of settler attacks and access restrictions since January 2023. It also reported that March 2026 recorded the highest number of Palestinian injuries by Israeli settlers in 20 years. Brookings noted that Israeli authorities demolished 871 Palestinian homes in the West Bank in 2024, the highest figure in at least 2 decades, and that demolitions continued at a high level in 2025, including in East Jerusalem. As stated earlier, the narrative linking Israeli expansion in the West Bank with biblical ties to the land has been internalized by the majority of Israeli society. Under the current Israeli right-wing government, the narrative has become more explicit. Some ministers and settler leaders openly oppose a Palestinian state and support deeper Israeli control over the West Bank and are now making claims over foreign territories across Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. The post-October 7 period fits the essay's broader argument. The Middle East remains unstable because conflict is repeatedly managed through force without resolving the political conditions that produce it. The situation in Israel and the Palestinian territories is also very much tied to the geopolitical actors responsible for making key decisions. Right now, it is important to highlight Netanyahu and Hamas as 2 protagonists equally responsible for favoring the conflictual status quo at the expense of any negotiation for peace. The conflict is often described as asymmetric. On one side is Israel, a state with military superiority, territorial control over occupied land, and strong support from the United States. On the other side are Palestinians, divided among occupation in the West Bank, blockade and Hamas rule in Gaza, exile, and limited self-rule under the Palestinian Authority, while seeking national self-determination under conditions of structural weakness. The asymmetry does not mean that leadership choices have become irrelevant. Israeli governments, Palestinian authorities, and armed movements all made decisions that entrenched a zero-sum conflict. Israeli policy frequently prioritized control, deterrence, and settlement facts on the ground over a political solution. The complicated relationship between the Gulf monarchies and the Palestinian leadership has also played an important role in the intractability of the Israel-Palestine conflict. One of the least covered stories is the fact that Yasser Arafat, the PLO leader, made the strategic mistake of aligning himself with Saddam Hussein during the First Gulf War in 1991 and the invasion of Kuwait. That decision proved almost fatal for Gulf monarchies' ties with the Palestinian leadership, relegating the Palestinian issue to a lower priority for decades, despite public statements defending Palestinian interests. Their focus shifted to economic development and strategic positioning with the United States and Israel. The United Arab Emirates and Bahrain became signatories of the Abraham Accords in 2020. These accords, which also included Morocco and initially Sudan, were a critical victory for Israel. They represented a major setback for the Palestinians. In addition, for the Gulf monarchies, Hamas has been perceived as a direct proxy of Iran and a regional threat. This view is set against the backdrop of the Sunni-Shia rivalry, a critical factor in Middle East volatility. The Palestinian question was first formed by empire and colonial rule, then by competing national movements, by war and displacement, and later by occupation, settlement expansion, political division, and armed resistance. Religion is part of this history but does not explain the events of the last 100 years. Nationalism is part of it, but it does not provide a full perspective on all key contributing factors. The conflict has persisted because history, faith, sovereignty, identity, and power have collided, creating an impossible conundrum for the region and the global community. Looking at the Middle East's volatility, Palestine is one of the region's main fault lines in modern history. It sits at the crossroad of colonialism, state-building, nationalism, occupation, resistance, and regional politics in a manner few other conflicts do. And because it has remained unresolved for so long, it acts as a flag-bearer of the wider instability across the Middle East.